Welcome back to another edition of MindFit. My name is Robert Aceves, and I have Neil Babins right here next to me. How you doing, Neil?
Doing great. How about yourself?
I'm super happy to do this podcast once again. Getting a lot of really good feedback from people, so thank you so much to everyone for listening once again. And how was your weekend?
Weekend was fabulous. I was up in Lake Tahoe with a bunch of friends, and it was so relaxing and so amazingly beautiful. And it actually snowed on the last night that we were there.
That's awesome.
8 inches of snow on top of the cars type snow. And unfortunately, we had canceled our snowmobiling event because there wasn't enough snow. And the last day that we leave, there's this huge gargantuan storm. So I'm like, there we go.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How was New York, by the way?
New York City was incredible. I was there the week prior. Manhattan's one of my favorite places in the world. I saw a couple of shows, went on a couple of tours to the Ellis Island, 9/11 Museum, and Statue of Liberty. And 9/11 is something to see, the museum, if you haven't seen it, right near the Oculus, a new shopping plaza they've put together. And I just think New Yorkers even say this, they've changed a lot since 9/11. And I do notice that. They are much more collectivist and much more kind in a New York kind of way, but they still are much more agreeable and approachable. I mean, it's a whole different vibe. I'm not afraid to walk at night there by myself anymore, and it's a different city. It's an amazing city.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I love New York.
So
I've been there in a long time, but I'm glad and jealous that you went.
No, it's waiting for you. I warmed it up. It was 22 degrees the first night, and it was like 60 the second day.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, they said
that's a huge difference.
Yeah, they've never seen a winter that warm. They said.
Wow.
They said I'm welcome to come back and warm it up for you again if you want.
Sounds good to me, man.
Yeah.
Maybe one day we'll do one of these shows over there.
In New York, yeah.
That'd be great. So today we're going to be talking about setting boundaries without causing resentment. Recently, I had an experience with a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine. We were having dinner and we were talking, and suddenly he was, talking about some stuff from work and school and things like that. And then I asked him about his personal relationship, his love life. And I thought it was just a normal question you can ask anybody, right? And then suddenly he looked at me and he's like, Robert, I am setting my boundaries. I'm not going to tell you anything about my personal life and my love life. And I was like, whoa, where did that come from? Because we were having a nice conversation, but the way he worded it almost made me feel resentful and made me feel bad that he was setting some boundaries on me. And I was like, dude, I don't understand why you want to do that. Like, I just want to know how you're doing, like, in your life. I mean, do you have someone that you care about? Is there something in your life that, that you're interested in, man or woman? I don't know. Maybe that's why you're so setting your boundaries, because you don't want to tell me something. And he's like, no, I'm not going to talk about it. Let's end the conversation, move on to something else. And I was like, okay. So, and that made me think, okay, why don't we talk about that today and try to see, how can we set up boundaries? Because, sometimes boundaries are healthy, but sometimes I think that they could cause resentment on other people. Or what do you think,
Yeah, I think that what happens is that when somebody wants to set a boundary like you're just discussing, what happens is that you get a lot of feelings that come up at the same time. So somebody asks me a question that I find controversial or challenging, and I don't want to really answer it. I notice in myself, I sort of cramp up and I feel it in my body. I feel anger. I feel maybe a little bit of helplessness because I'm kind of trapped. Maybe I feel disappointment that the conversation went there. I feel frustrated. Maybe I'm embarrassed by the answer. Or a whole bunch of different things come up, or afraid to lose friendship or to be seen in a bad light. So what happens is I presence myself to what I'm feeling. If I'm asked a question that I find to be crossing the line or something that's causes irritation, and I try to presence myself with those feelings and then answer the person. So I could say, I don't really like that kind of a question, and here's why. And I can kind of explain how I'm feeling about that. And then in the explanation, I'm kind of answering the question at the same time. You know what I'm saying? Meaning I don't really feel comfortable talking about that right now for a variety of reasons, but I'm not making the other person responsible for the fact that I feel all those things. Like, you asked me a question, okay, so you irritated me. But I'm irritated anyway by that question, right? It's got nothing to do with you. It doesn't matter who asks it. So, and if it does, then it's personal. Then I'll say, Robert, I have an issue, but it wouldn't. But it's not about you. It's about what I was just asked, right? So I just presence myself to what am I feeling, prior to setting the boundary, because then I could communicate to a person how come the boundary is being set, and it doesn't sound personal, so the person doesn't get resentful or disappointed or, feel like they've been attacked.
Right. I tell you, I tend to cross the line a lot. I love asking questions that are very deep and sometimes, very personal to people. And that's one of the things I was telling my friend. I said, I value you as a friend. And as a friend, I like to not have boundaries between us and what we talk about, because I feel like when you have a friend, you should be able to talk about anything, and that's at least my perspective on that. But then I understand, and I try to see his point of view and try to understand that sometimes people don't feel like sharing some things. And that's the hard part for me to understand, which is why I wanted to talk about this today. Is it really, necessary to have boundaries sometimes between friends? Is it really necessary to have boundaries with your, therapist, for example? Because sometimes you go to a therapist and you want to share everything with them, right? Because you want them to know everything about you. But then at the same time, sometimes when we share too much, we feel like, oh my gosh, I think I just said too much. And then we have this guilty feeling as well. So I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, with a therapist, of course, the boundaries are not necessarily about what you share, but they're about what you engage in outside that relationship, outside that that agreement between the two, between client and therapist.
Right.
But in terms of what you can share, certainly, hopefully, you feel safe enough to do so. If you're seeing a therapist and you don't feel safe enough to share something, that's a question you might want to ask yourself. But that's a separate podcast. I mean, you said with a friend you should want to share everything. Yeah, but at the same time, with a friend, you can also feel safe enough to say, I don't really like going there. Or explaining to them, feeling vulnerable enough yet safe enough to tell them what about that particular domain or subject or topic or question is undesirable for you. And if they're really your friend, I think they will understand without reacting with resentment. You see, there's people who react with a lot of resentment to your answer, I think have their own feelings to deal with. And instead of, making it about what you just said, in other words, I'm not responsible for your reaction beyond a certain point. If I explain to you, this is why I'm not comfortable with that topic, or this is why I don't really like that question, and I'm not intending it to hurt you. But if you still feel hurt after that explanation, that's when I cut the cord and say, okay, well, let me know if I can support you in that. Otherwise, that's it. That's it. The law is drawn. The line is drawn, so to speak.
And I tell you, I did feel resentful. I did tell him that I felt like he didn't trust me, because I felt like, if you trusted me, then you would tell me everything, right? Because I have that idea in my mind. But at the same time, I'm thinking that perhaps, like you said, maybe I have a problem there. But then I did tell him that, he also might have a problem by not being able to share some of this personal stuff. And then I told him to think about that too. Like, why is it that it's so hard for you to share some things, and others not hard at all, and in this case in particular was his love life, which, it made me feel like he was hiding something. And, maybe he wasn't. Maybe he just really didn't have anything to say about that. But the fact that he said, I'm setting my boundaries, really, really, did something to me. And maybe I have the problem, like you said, that someone doesn't want to share with me stuff. Because, I've been helping people for 27 years now, almost 30 years. And so I've asked people all kinds of questions, and I've had people that come and they tell me their whole lives, and then they never want to come see me again, because they feel ashamed that they share some really deep stuff. And I get that, but at the same time, I feel like it'd be nice, at least on my side, I feel like if I find somebody that I can trust and I can tell anything, it would be like finding gold,
Maybe a lot of the times when people do pour out their hearts or draw boundaries, they might feel that they're being judged for doing it, And
That's true.
Yeah, and that could be, at least in therapy, if somebody feels judged or somebody feels not heard or somebody, but I always remind people, you're talking to a complete stranger, and I get that. And that's why it's so difficult to be so vulnerable, so open. But, I think also, there's a difference between resentment when you have resentment, for example, and that's why you're drawing boundaries with somebody, if you go underneath the resentment and you try to process what feelings you're really having, say it's about sadness or disappointment or helplessness or fear, if you deal with your actual core emotions, then you could draw a boundary and feel more confident about that boundary. And people say, well, if you're really looked at your feelings and healed them, you would have forgiveness. And a lot of people assume that forgiveness means reconciliation. It means just letting everybody back in your life who originally put the hurt there. But not necessarily. You could still deal with all of your core emotions and say, I'm still drawing a boundary, so you're not going to do that again. You know what I'm saying? I'm not interested in having you back in my life, but that doesn't mean I'm resentful. It means that I've been working on my feelings and I've healed my feelings, and I'm not inviting them to be bombarded again. If you can demonstrate to me that won't happen, and of course you can come back into my life, but on my terms now.
Right.
And people say, well, then you haven't forgiven. Like, yes, you have. I'm not holding you at emotional gunpoint, but there's still a boundary there. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it's, there's so much to boundaries, by the way. It's not just when it comes to conversations. It could also be, like physical boundaries. You don't want people to touch you in certain ways or touch you at all. You just want your body to be, something that you just don't want touched. And I get that, but at sometimes, people feel like they have to be, please other people. And that's, I think, where we need the boundaries, because sometimes, like I know this lady that works a lot, and she works so much time, overtime, constantly working 14, 16 hours a day, and 5-6 days a week, and she's starting to get burned out. And she's not setting the boundaries of time with her job and saying, you know what, I'm only going to work this days or this times. Or with her clients, if she's a therapist, for example, if you're a therapist and people call you all the time and they have questions and they're constantly bombarding you, you may burn out faster. So it's important to set up boundaries and healthy ones. The key is, how do you do it without causing resentment? How do you make it so that people don't feel like you're hurting them or trying to make them feel bad,
Yeah, self-care boundaries, like you just brought up, are extremely important too. And to answer your question, I think, how do you do it without building resentment? Well, there's a point where you might not be able to do it without building a resentment. Someone else's, like I said earlier, someone else's reaction to your drawing boundaries over and above a certain point is really not your responsibility, because your intention in drawing those boundaries is to take care of you. It's not to in any way injure them. But sometimes there's collateral damage when you're taking care of yourself. Sometimes taking care of you means somebody else doesn't get what they want.
Right.
Sometimes. And that's difficult, particularly in a relationship, an intimacy between two people, because, you want to take care of each other. You have to take care of yourself first and put on your own oxygen mask first, as they say. So what if I put on my own and then, there's none left for you? So that's a very delicate balance. But, you're not responsible for somebody else's the fallout of you taking care of yourself first. You must fill up your own bucket first. You must, and that means emotionally, physically. If that poor woman's working, 16 hours a day, like you said, oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, there comes a point where I got to say, the doctor is out. I'm not a doctor, but the doctor is out. I close my computer and that's it. I'm not taking another email unless it's a crisis. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important to also start slow, because if you've never set boundaries, like this lady suddenly told her job, like, okay, I'm not going to work, 16 hours. I'm only going to work 8 hours. That would be pretty harsh from that job, right? And I get that, it's important to set boundaries, but if you haven't done it your entire life and you're going to start today, I think it's important to start little by little, maybe slowing down maybe a couple hours a day, and then maybe another 2 hours the following week, and so forth, until you can get back to, quote unquote normal, like 8 hours a day. So, and sometimes, if we get sick or burned out, sometimes our bodies just run out and we have to take, days off for being sick. And so that's what happens when you don't take care of yourself. But, the idea is, if you start slowly, practicing this, because it's a form of, it also requires practice, because like if you've never set boundaries with your partner, for example, and then suddenly you feel like you need to, it's important to go slow, because if you just tell them directly, hey, I want to set boundaries from now on, and I don't want you to touch me ever again, that relationship could break. And so I think it's important to go little by little until you both get to a balanced place where you're both happy. What do you think?
I think you're right. And I think what happens a lot of times when we do get very direct with people, when we haven't set boundaries for a long time, what's happening there is that a party is jumping in to take the lead that is more adamant and direct and bold, because you're afraid of all the feelings that have been built up over time. So it's very vulnerable feeling to set a boundary with somebody within which you've never set it before.
Right. Oh yeah,
right?
totally.
It's very scary. It's very there's a lot of feelings that probably built up over time. Now, if you don't want someone, for example, touching you a certain way, but you've been putting up with it for 6 months, you have a lot of feelings there. So you're going to snap in order to get it to stop. But what you want to do is stop. Take a look at all the feelings that you do feel, whether it's vulnerability or helplessness or frustration, embarrassment, fear of loss of the friendship, perhaps. And just be with those feelings for a few seconds and then speak on the behalf of the feelings and draw the boundary. Don't just allow that angry part of you to jump in and take over, because that's going to break, you're right, that's going to break the friendship. It's going to make someone feel attacked anyway.
Right. So, well, for example, the touching part. I love hugging people. I love, touching people, not in a bad way, I guess, but I'm like Italians. When you go to Italy, people touch each other too much. And so I feel like, somebody doesn't like to be touched. And I have had this before with friends from high school, for example. There's one of my best friends from high school doesn't like getting hugs or touched at all. And I always, wanted to hug him or, say hi. And every single time he'd get really upset and he would tell me, please don't touch me. And he'd try to set boundaries. But then I would just do it automatically, try to touch him. And so until I had to learn to not do that, and I always thought in my mind, like, this guy has issues and he needs to get better at it and, accept that hugs are good for you and they're healthy and he, all these different things. And you start justifying, right, your actions and trying to, do what you want. But in the case of him, he does not like getting touched. And so it's important to look at his past and the way he grew up and his family. And I doubt he's going to look at my past, and say, oh, he's Mexican. They love touching each other or hugging each other all the time. It's usually we that have to, try to understand the other person and see where they're coming from and hopefully meet somewhere in the middle and try to come up with something. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to have that friendship, I think. Or what do you think?
Yeah, compassion is a very important part of setting boundaries. You have a compassion for somebody else's behavior, then you could understand and moderate more what you're going to say to them and how you're going to say it. If you understand that somebody comes from a place where, physical touch meant something different than it does to you, having compassion for that means it's not personal.
Yeah.
So if I want to draw boundaries, and I can't imagine switching it around and saying, well, in this house we hug, well, I don't know if that's a boundary or that's it's more of a comedy.
Right.
But whatever boundary you're going to set, having compassion for why somebody else has not been living into that boundary prior, will help you to moderate your feelings before you draw the boundary. In other words, you don't have to get angry or bold or direct about it. It allows you to be able to draw it with a little bit more sensitivity and compassion, both for yourself and somebody else. And it gives you a better shot at being able to draw those boundaries, Then again, some people say to me, a lot of clients say to me, but some people just don't listen. I can say it with sensitivity. It's just going to go right over their heads. I'm like, well, there you go. Then you say, well, listen, I've tried to be sensitive, but but now I'm just going to have to tell you straight out. The answer is no. I'm sorry if that upsets you. That's it. So.
Right. Yeah. And it's also important to practice self-awareness and know, if you're doing things that bother other people, and try to see what you're doing and why you're doing it, and see if you can avoid doing that in front of those people. Because everybody has, like you said, if you practice compassion and you try to understand their feelings, we all have issues. We all do in some way or another. But, setting boundaries is important to be able to, take care of ourselves. So self-care should always be number one priority for everybody. So if you know that you don't like, certain things and you keep putting yourself in situations where those things happen and you can't avoid it, then you're constantly going to feel bad. And that makes it into a toxic relationship, right? Or a toxic situation. And so the best thing to do is to get away from that. But if you could set boundaries and still be able to function in that relationship, I think that'd be great. Or I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, if you don't say anything, you allow yourself to deplete over time because you're just trying to hang in there, so to speak. A lot of people are talked about this recently, are people pleasers. You know,
Yeah.
well, they really just want to please everybody around them, and it takes a lot of energy to do. You know, because you're avoiding the disappointment of disappointing somebody else. And perhaps the fear of losing somebody else's respect or validation. And those are all very powerful feelings. And that's one of the reasons that people, placate and people please. And it's tough to do. It's tough to disappoint somebody else, to have somebody angry or disappointed or frustrated with you when you have all those feelings that come up around that, because you feel safer when you don't upset people.
Right.
Your intention is not to upset people. Your intention is to take care of you. Some people are going to be upset with that, and that is okay.
Yeah. And another thing, you can do is to seek support. Maybe go to a group where people don't like getting hugged and see how other people feel about it.
Is there such a group? I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know.
But,
Someone Google that.
Right.
I don't know.
By finding people that are like you, maybe you'll feel better, not feel like, like you're some weirdo or something, because, there are people that have the same feelings as you do in certain situations, and people who have gone through traumas or things that have happened to a lot of people. And if you find a group that has that, it makes you feel better in some ways, and it's one way to heal and to find that support that you need in order to not feel like you're some weirdo or that you're a people pleaser and you're trying to get people to like you. But sometimes it's better to just be you, and if you have people like you around you, then you don't have to try to be any different. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like People Pleasers Anonymous, Yeah.
Yeah.
But everybody has their thing. Everybody has their defenses. People pleasing is a big one. Overworking is another one. Overachieving, a big one also, because there's feelings that we have to sit with or be with if we don't do the very thing that we always do. As soon as we slow down and stop, we start to feel certain things, or interactions with other people. If we're not always behaving as if we have it together, that means we're trying to avoid looking vulnerable. But being vulnerable, as unpleasant as the actual feeling might feel, it gives you such a rich feeling to be able to be with. It really is. And we often think that emotions that are unpleasant or uncomfortable are bad or negative. And one of my gurus here is Dr. Joan Rosenberg. You should watch her TED Talk if you haven't. She talks about this specifically, that emotions that are uncomfortable, like say vulnerability or sadness or helplessness, they feel uncomfortable, but they're not bad or negative. They're just as rich as joy and feeling euphoric. And you have to be able to feel your vulnerability, be with your vulnerability. And it gives you such self-agency, because if I feel vulnerable, I don't have to try to not feel vulnerable, because I already do. So I can then walk into that vulnerability, take action anyway, and, have a conversation with somebody when I'm feeling socially anxious, or that I might be rejected, or that I might be disappointing somebody. I'm vulnerable anyway. What difference does it make? You're going to, but if you feel the vulnerability and then take action, that's how you become more confident. You don't wait for the vulnerability to subside or pretend it's not there and then act confident, because you could see right through that. And that's going to deplete you over time. If you're acting confident when you're really not, it may get you results, but over time you're going to get depleted on that. And, eventually it's going to crash, because you're trying to push away your vulnerability. Allow yourself to be vulnerable. Be scared. It's okay.
Right. Yeah. So going back to setting boundaries without causing resentment, I would say one of the best ways that I would do it, if I ever, a lot of times I don't feel the need to set boundaries myself, but I feel like if I were to do it, the way I would do it is say, I really appreciate you, but I really don't like getting hugged. Thank you for trying to hug me, but I, rather not. And just be nice about it, You don't have to be like, oh, I don't like getting hugged, and some people just really like push you away like you're some kind of virus or something.
Right,
I've
right.
had that happen when I get sick. I'm not conscious or aware that I have a virus on me, and I try to hug someone, and they're like, oh, stay away from me. I don't want you to get me sick. And that kind of feels bad as again, going back to being resentful, but at the same time I get where they're coming from, and so I think that there are ways to do it in a nicer way, and always focus on the positive, and they say something nice to the person, and try to explain to them why you're doing what you're doing, instead of just like, I don't even want to see you or be in the same room as you are because I don't want to get sick, especially right now with the coronavirus. No.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. If you could explain, where you're coming from and not make somebody else the fault of the reason that you don't want to hug them, like, again, they won't feel attacked.
Right.
And the more in touch you can be with, like I said earlier, like vulnerability or whatever you can be in touch with, the more you can not hold somebody else responsible for the boundary that you're drawing. I'm drawing the boundary because I want to take care of me, and it's not a person I don't want in my space. It's a behavior. It's a pattern. It's what somebody brings to the space that I don't want in it. So, it's about explaining that you're taking care of yourself, and it's not you per se. And even if it is you, it really isn't you. It's just what happens every time you're in my space.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah.
Especially, like I mentioned earlier that I was in India in December. The boundaries there are so limited. People literally are right next to you and touching your body in multiple ways, and I don't mind it, but I could totally see people who do, and it feels so uncomfortable sometimes, and what do you do in those situations to try to be nice? And some people, I've seen tourists like literally push people away, physically. And, sometimes it's okay to do that. But if you're in a different country where, you might get beat up, I think there are better ways to do it in a nice way. Maybe not put yourself in situations where you're going to be touched like that. It's really hard, I tell you, in India, because you have to stand in line for so many different things, and people push themselves all over, and not just in India, in Japan, in Mexico, in multiple countries. That is a thing, in the U.S. is not, we do have that bubble that's pretty big, and we don't want anyone in our space, but sometimes you can't avoid it if you want to travel, for example.
Yeah, and that's when it comes back to what we said before about compassion, understanding cultural compassion, know that when a person behaves a certain way in a certain different contexts, it's a different vocabulary. They're expressing something different, or not expressing anything at all. So in the U.S., we would feel that that's kind of rude if you came into my bubble, if you reached over me, or if you pushed me aside. But in another country, it might not be considered rude or have any intention of being rude. So having compassion for where somebody else is coming from is also a very important component. It's to knowing if you need to draw boundaries, or you just need to ride it out for 2 weeks because you're coming home anyway. Unless you're going to live in India, then you may want to understand how you can adjust your own feelings to their context. Wherever you're gonna end up living, like when in Rome,
Right?
And just from India to Italy, that's a pretty big jump there. But yeah,
I think the best thing to do is to be flexible, but sometimes it's not easy to be flexible, and I think that's when we need to set up the boundaries. To be aware of where our limits are, and then obviously continue to grow and work on that and try to improve ourselves. But at the same time, understand that we are in power of what happens to us, and so we can decide if we want something or don't want it in our lives. And I feel like that's important to know and to keep in mind, because a lot of times we lose that, especially when you have to work and you have a job and you get a paycheck, and so you have to do certain things that you don't like, and if you don't do them, then you might lose the job, or if your boss is doing stuff that he shouldn't or she shouldn't be doing, and if you say something, you might lose that job. And so it's hard to do sometimes, but if you work on it, then eventually you might find maybe another job, or maybe a way to set the boundaries without hurting other people.
Yeah, exactly. And there's always, again, that's that vulnerability. If I do set my boundaries or I do say something, do I stand to lose something? When we're very young, one of the reasons that we don't say anything when we're kids is because we have a fear of making the situation worse.
Yeah.
fear of escalating things, fear of getting things overwhelmed, or maybe when we reach adolescence, we sort of say, well, what's the point? I'd argue with my mother, but what's the point? And the point is not winning the argument or getting your mom to change your mind or getting somewhere in terms of a result necessarily. It's to take care of yourself. Don't let yourself sit on something that needs to be said. Don't get into that habit, because if you push that too far down, eventually you're going to normalize the idea of not saying something when you want to say something. So say it. And if it's dangerous, of course not. But I mean, if you're in an abusive situation or something like that, I understand that, you got to take care of that first and foremost. But if you're just afraid of being bombarded or having people disagree with you, that's why a lot of kids shut down. I work with a lot of kids because they just don't want all the bombardment. Mm-hmm. But we exercise the idea of get used to the bombardment. Get used to the feelings. I know it's uncomfortable, but what's even more uncomfortable is when you shut down, what happens later on in life, mm-hmm. when you don't have access to the feelings that will give you that kind of freedom. So drawing boundaries, even when you're young, can be important.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like it's a good skill to have, and if you do it in a nice way, it's really more powerful, because then you can, have people respect you better than people hating you for setting boundaries in some ways. And I feel like this. I mean, I want to hear what people have to say, because I feel like mm-hmm. this can be very broad, and I don't think we have enough time to talk about everything that comes with setting boundaries. But please share with us what boundaries you've set in your life, and what things you feel that are healthy, and what things you think that we said that we didn't say that we needed to say, or that mm-hmm. if you agree with what we just said or not said. Feel free to leave us a comment on Facebook. We have our MindFit Facebook page that's doing really well now. Mm-hmm. And you can also send us a message on YouTube, because we have all this podcasts now on YouTube. So you can just go to the comments and leave your comments. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's MindFit. I think it's just YouTube and MindFit. So just look MindFit and you'll find us there. Oh, actually, no, MindFit Podcast. That's how you can find it on YouTube. So any last words, Neil?
No, that's a good suggestion. Just if you have any questions or something you want to expand upon with what we've talked about, leave us a message on Facebook or on YouTube, and I'll do our very best to get back to you and expand more on the conversation. So I realize it's a huge topic. And there's probably a lot of intricacies we don't think about, and I get that. So, yeah.
No, I totally, as we were talking, all these things came to my mind, mm-hmm. of things that we could talk about in the future. But anyway, a thumbs up, and I really appreciate everyone listening to us, and those people who have been following us by now. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you so much, and for sharing this with your friends and your family. I really appreciate that. Please keep it going, because we're doing really great, and we want to continue to do this for a long time. So thank you, and remember, we're here every Tuesday at 6 p.m. And wherever you listen to your podcasts, or on YouTube as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by MindFit. Please help us to share this podcast with your friends and family to grow this community. And if you'd like to donate to this podcast, or if you'd like to share your comments, questions, or concerns, send them to mindfitpodcast@gmail.com, or you can call us directly at 714-328-4661.